Hi, I am Alberto Calva from Accus Consulting. I am based in Toronto, Canada, and today is December the 2nd, 2020. Yesterday, Statistics Canada released the information regarding the gross domestic product of Canada up to the third quarter of 2020. And we can see with that information that the country has already been 3 quarters in recession. Let me explain you this information with 3 graphs. But before that, let's review some general concepts we need for this. A, the gross domestic product is the measurement of the value of the total production of goods and services in a country or a society or for each province for a certain period of time, usually a quarter or a year, even though in Canada we have calculations monthly. The GDP could be similar to what are the sales of a company or what could be the household income for a family. Second, the increase in the GDP is measured in real terms. This is inflation adjusted. Third, the way to measure the growth for comparison purposes is to compare one quarter with the same quarter from the previous year. This is what we know as Q over Q minus 4. What we mean about this, if we want to analyze the third quarter of 2020, we have to compare it with the third quarter of 2019 and so on. It can also be done comparing with the previous quarter, which is what we know Q over Q minus 1. But that means that if we are comparing the third quarter of 2020 with the second quarter of 2020. And I'll show you there is a problem with this, but I'll show you it to you in a graph in a moment. The recession is when there are 2 consecutive quarters with a negative rate. This is a GDP decrease. The GDP of an economy has to grow above 0, yes, but it should really grow at least above the growth rate of the population. This is in order to maintain the average income per person. The population in Canada has been growing in the last years at a rate more or less of 1.2%. Therefore, we need our GDP to grow at least at that rate or above that rate. Okay, let me show you this first graph. In the blue bars here, we can see the growth rates of the GDP of Canada compared with the same quarter from the previous year. For example, in 2020, the GDP of Canada decreased 0.3%. This is when we compared it with the GDP of the first quarter of 2019. The second quarter, there was a decrease of minus 12.5%, which means there was a decrease in the second quarter of 2020 compared with the GDP of the second quarter of 2019. And at last, in this last quarter, in the third quarter of 2020, there was a decrease of 5.2%, which means a decrease compared with the third quarter of 2019. This means that after 3 quarters, we can see we have been in recession all this year. There are 3 quarters with a decrease or a negative rate in all of them. Okay, now, this is what we have seen in many media. And they have been saying that the economy in Canada grew 40.5% in the last quarter. Yes, but let's check this information. This is the growth compared with the previous quarter, and it is annualized. So when we say that in the first quarter, the decrease was 7.3%, it is compared with the GDP of the fourth quarter of 2019. Then we have an annualized rate decrease of 38.1% compared with the second quarter of 2020. And yes, in the third quarter, there was an increase of 40.5% after a decrease of 38 and a decrease of 7.3. So even though the rate is quite large, it doesn't mean that there has been a recovery. Let me explain you this with a simple example. Look at this. Let's assume that in the last quarter of 2019, the GDP of Canada was $100. Then in the first quarter, there was a decrease of 7.3% annualized. This means that in the quarter, it was only minus 1.9%. So 100 minus 1.9 means that at the end of the first quarter, the economy of Canada were $98.1. Second quarter, there was a decrease of 38.1%, which is an annualized rate. For the quarter, it was only minus 11.3%. So this $98.1 that we had decreased 11.3%, which in dollars is 11.1. This means that at the end of the second quarter, the GDP of Canada was only $87. In the third quarter, there was an increase of 40.5% annualized. Yes, and this means that only for the quarter, it was an increase of only 8.9%. But 8.9% over $87. So 87, 8.9 means that there was an increase in $7.7. And at the end of the third quarter, the GDP of Canada in this example would be 94.8%. This means that yes, looking at numbers this way, there has been a recovery, but not large enough as to recover what has happened in the first two quarters of the year. But let's look at the numbers of the amount of GDP of Canada. Look at this graph. Here we can see in the blue bars is the GDP in billions of chain dollars of Canada of 2012. This is more or less the same as billions of constant dollars or dollars adjusted by inflation. And we have all of them to the purchase power of 2012. We have eliminated inflation in this calculation or in this graph. And this is the way it's usually shown. Now, the green line, the green dotted line, this is a regression that was calculated by me. And for this linear regression, what I did is I took the actual information, the historical information we have from the first quarter of 2011 to the fourth quarter of 2019. And with that information, we run this statistical process and we get this line that can show us the trend of where the GDP of Canada should be located, has been located, and should be located in the coming quarters. And we can see here clearly that already in the first quarter of 2020, we were below the green line. This is, we were not doing as well. Not much, but we're not doing as well. But then what happened in the second quarter? In the second quarter, there's a larger distance from the green line. This is, after 3 quarters, in this second quarter of recession, we can see we are $287 billion below the green line, which is 14% below of the GDP we should be having in dollar amount. On the third quarter, we have had some recovery. Luckily, we have, but still we are 6% below, which is more or less $133 billion below the green line, not below the level that we had, but below the level that we should be if we assume that we should be following the trend that we historically have been having with the GDP. Yes, there is a recovery, but I would say that for sure, the fourth quarter of 2020 is still going to be a recession, and very likely the first quarter of 2021. Second, third, and fourth, we hope that there's going to be a growth, and the recovery to be in the levels that we had at the end of 2019 we will have that at the end of year 2021. But still, per capita, it'll take us at least 1 or 2 more years to recover that level. I hope this information has been useful for you to understand the GDP of Canada, to understand when we talk about recession, and most of all, to understand how the economies and us business people, how we should be basing our decision making and our investment decisions for the coming months. I am Alberto Calva from Accus Consulting. We are based in Toronto, Canada, and today is December the 2nd, 2020. Thank you very much.